Really?
And we seem to be live, almost. I'm a bit sort of glitchy, but not more than usual, and I can blame that on the technology. So with me today is Zara Altair on Scroggin, and I'm normally John Kellden, and today I'm really John Kellden all the time, I hope. Um, we were just talking about stories and how stories mean very different things to different people. For instance, in marketing, we now and then need to help people who use big, convoluted, technical, jargony words to use words that normal people can actually understand. And I'm the worst sinner of them all, probably, to just actually try to tell people that and also sort of to go against that rule myself. So, and stories has to do with unfolding storylines, I think. Stories has also something to do with conversations, I think. And what stories are beyond that is basically anyone's guess, because it means anything and everything to most people. So there was an episode 1 that was called Questions. So if you'd all feel inclined to watch that as a preamble to this, kind of feel free and give us a shout, and we will send you the link post haste. Well, the story I sort of first came to think of when it comes to unfolding storylines is the sort of the hero's journey. But I'm not sure if we're going to sort of embark on that sort of that big, profound journey just yet, right? Should we do some kind of warm-up stories to begin with? What say you, Sarah? Go ahead.
Well, stories is in the sense of conversation and communicating with people, stories is a way of revealing yourself. So, well, it's an interesting, I'm working with someone right now on a book project as a ghostwriter, and it's actually a very scholarly thing that he is doing, but at the same time, the way that he is telling the story of his discovery, and so it makes it very personal and engaging, whereas if he presented it in a scholarly manner, um, it would be dry. And I think that's the knack of getting people involved in whatever it is that you're doing. Is the wow, I looked at this and this is what I saw and nobody else saw this. Um, is kind of the premise of his book, and 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 he tells it as a story. I looked at this and then I thought that and I looked at this and then all of a sudden there was this thing, and so story is a way of bringing people in and engaging them, and it's the same thing we were talking about, using industry specific words which may limit limit your audience. So, and on Google Plus, whatever it is that people are doing, we also share stories about, our daily life, or, what our pets are doing, or whatever, which is a way of helping people get to know you as a human being. And I think that's the essence of where we are in this series of conversations, is that it's a human-to-human connection.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you, Ron, you've also some considerable expertise in producing other people's stories. Right? I mean, although your medium has mostly been music.
Yeah.
producing other people's stories, and did you say although my medium is music?
Yeah, I mean,
Did you
yeah.
say
Uh,
although?
um,
Just a
it's
technical
kind
question.
no, I mean
uh,
that's a good catch because it's
oh,
kind of
good.
when I usually think stories, I sort of think bedtime stories, marketing stories, kind of mostly words, right? But I mean, it's a good thing that we have you on board, where you've obviously also sort of dabbled with the occasional word, right? But music is also, how to put that, text, right? It's as much story as a text-based story.
It is.
I remember when I remember a incident when my daughter was pretty young. How was she? Must have been 4 or 5 years old, I guess. And I just picked up my guitar and just strummed a chord. And and she said, "Daddy, it sounds like you're telling a story. It
Mm,
sounds like you're about to tell a story."
yeah.
And so therefore, I think you're right. And there's an anecdotal indication that I hope illustrates just what you said, and it's very.
Yeah.
So I think that's very true.
Yeah. I mean, rumor has it that
Story.
all the Icelandic laws, which during 1,000 years thereabouts were sort of transmitted orally from the old judge to the new judge, and so it
Yeah.
went, right, for a long time. And rumor has it that that was sort of declared in a sort of a rhythmical sense, right? I mean, it wasn't a pop song because it was in Icelandic and it was sort of law, right? How you should sort of be killed if you killed someone else. So it's kind of not a sort of a bit of a dry topic there as well, right? But still some kind of
Yeah.
music and most definitely a story, right? Because large parts of what has kept Iceland going as a whole nation and as a culture is nested together with this Alting, which is the Icelandic word for you gather together on a hill and you deal with the recalcitrants and reward the valorous and whatever you do in Iceland, right? With,
Yeah, the other
with
thing that,
anything from pigs and broadswords and I mean the common fare in stories, right? Uh, uh, they
but
haven't
the all
changed
thing
all
was
that much in time.
was totally oral, so storytelling had a lot to do with how a presentation before everyone. It was story. It was story in a legal format, but it was still story.
Yeah,
That's all thing. And everybody listened. I mean, everybody was there. Everybody.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, you got your say as well, right? And then there was this judge who then sort of declared sort of the closing story, if you will. So there's
Right.
quite a bit to. I'm struggling mightily if I sort of would sneak in the word narrative here, but then we would sort of go down the narrative black hole and everything would be lost in this whole transmission, right? But I mean, um, if stories are keep going and you keep add to them and you keep annealing them and embellishing them and then changing them and modding them and hacking them and whatever you do with the story, telling and sharing them, it eventually might form into a narrative. It could be a Swedish narrative or an American narrative and all kinds of narratives, right? And I mean, it's still there's a kind of ongoing discussion to this day whether we would actually need two words, one story and another narrative. But in my view, and the reason why I'm bringing it up is kind of the theme of conversation we have. I've called unfolding storylines. So if stories are what provides, as you brilliantly outlined, Sarah, the bringing people in to the corner or to the marketing situation or to the hangout or to the outing or whatever you involve people in. Then the narrative is what sorts of got some kind of continuous line of inquiry, some kind of ongoing quest, ongoing journey, and that's obviously also the story. It's just that normally you add lots and lots of stories in some kind of a sequence.
Well, I think too, there's something about telling a story that helps people remember, and I think it's why, as children say, tell me the story of, the porcupine again, or whatever, and that for the same reason that people will reread a book, that they've read it before, but they read it again. And so I had a friend who says, books are your friends. There's like the story in there is part of your makeup because you've read the story, or in older traditions, the oral storytelling, and I know if I'm with my granddaughter and she says, tell me a story, and I make up the story on the spot, and then she goes, tell another one, tell another one. After she says again. and and they're very silly stories. I just make them up on the spot. The little bunnies went out and blah 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 blah, and I have no idea where the story's going when I start. But that stories are once heard, so we'll include reading in that. Stories once heard then become part of our personal history.
Yeah. I mean, we actually do have something called a social media stream, which is to everyone's suffering and despair, something that just sort of keeps going and it never stops because other people have the audacity to share every day lots and lots of stuff.
Yeah.
And if you see it as content, which is one of those sort of dreaded words, so it's kind of a bit of a story already in that word, right? But if we see it as collective intelligence, if we see it as a narrative, if we see it as an ongoing, continuous chain and sequence of stories, then suddenly you can actually suffer through more of it, right? You can actually sort of understand a bit more of I mean, given the proviso that it's not just all content marketing, right? Because that would be terrible. So that you can have this. I mean, reminds of a story, right? About sort of the guy who gets asked kind of with so much manure that there got to be a pony in there somewhere, right? So that basically took care of my view on sort of how to filter social media, right? You need to take the good with the bad, right? You need to take kind of all kinds of, and because who's to tell what's signal and what's noise, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's kind of, we have a kind of a master with us, Ron, right? You can tell everything there is to know about signal and noise, right?
Just ask me.
Yeah. So,
Just kidding.
no, I mean, noise is kind of part of the whole thing, right?
So what it's like, what makes a good story is like a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah, yeah.
And when you oftentimes that's not the case in the social stream. There isn't a beginning, a middle, and an end. So oftentimes on in those social streams with the posts after the post after the post, um, if something is happening, there's an engaged conversation within the stream, and the post itself is the catalyst that makes
Right.
the conversation happen.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so it's kind of a. I mean, I can only go for myself, right? When I go through the stream, I sometimes get lucky, right? And there's serendipity. So right at the moment when I sort of dip my toes in, hey presto, there's something from you guys or from someone else that I sort of connected with earlier, and it seems to make some sense given where I'm coming from and what I would sort of fancy reading or paying any which kind of attention to, right? So that is kind of a co-constructed story right on the spot with some kind of beginning, because I just scanned through the whole thing and there's an image or a header or a lady or whatnot, right? Something to sort of just spark things up. Then, I mean, the middle is kind of interesting because the middle is part in a dialogue, part me having a dialogue with anything, right? It could be, oh no, yet another catechist, right? How absolutely ghastly. I had my fill and more. And that is also kind of a good enough middle, right? Because then I need to think of, should I just go kill that person because he and she did share two catechins too many, right? Or should I restrain myself and sort of respond like proper, sensible, normal
Well, the thing
being?
about social media is that you have the option to ignore.
Yeah.
But when you're with people in real life, then it's a different situation.
Yeah.
If somebody pulls out the 19th grandchild picture, then it's a more difficult situation because you're face to face with them and you really don't care about the 19th grandchild picture.
That's my
And
limit.
and you're in a different situation altogether, which calls for some diplomacy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a thing or two to be said for whether it's scrolling or filtering or the diplomatic, careful evasion of the muddle in the middle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you suddenly feel yourself stumped. But it's kind of what also makes, sometimes this also makes the middle of the story interesting, because if everything would just sort of go according to plan, then it's actually not a story. It's kind of a beginning and a middle and an end, but it's not a story, it's a project. So
Right.
there's a difference in between the story and the project, right? The story, well, in theory, a project goes according to plan, right? And in the story, there's contingencies, which basically is kind of my lingo for when things doesn't go according to plan.
Mm-hmm.
And in life, that makes it all the more interesting, because then eventually at the end, at the closure, at sort of whatever catharsis and the heavenly choir sings, or Deo ex machina, or something else, and then curtains, right? Something ends, whether it's kind of my natural lifespan, or you running out of patience with me rambling on endlessly, or whatever closure there is, right? If nothing new would have happened in the middle, then it would make for a bit of a more boring end. At least I think so.
Yes, that's very true. And working with storytellers, that the usually one of the biggest challenges in telling a story, um, a fictional story, is making the middle interesting and keeping the story alive and engaging. And but I just lost the word you used, John, but it was perfect. Contingencies. You
Ah,
know,
yeah,
so you come up with contingencies that are challenging for the people involved in the story, the characters involved in the story, to move the story forward, because otherwise people are going to leave the story. They're going to go do something else instead.
Yeah.
I think
So,
the contingencies is a really good word.
Yeah. But there's
Because
also kind of
it
story arcs, right? And
it
structure
implies
and I mean, there's very difficult to. I mean, everyone understands the story, right? I mean, if I would say Once Upon a Time, all people's minds go immediately into story listening modes, and it's kind of we have it hardwired somehow, right? But I was going to ask you, Ron, that middle, if there's some structure. I mean, we could either go with the whole Kurt Vonnegut, right? But we might want to save Kurt Vonnegut for later on. For so I was thinking, there's a thing called refrain in music. There's a thing called bridge, and
yes.
I'm not sure if those are sort of to be lumped together in somewhere in the middle. Or can you have a bridge, and can you start a song with a bridge?
Well, a lot of pop songs earlier in the 20th century started with what was called a verse, I think. It was really like an introduction, and that's the first thing I thought of when I thought of beginning the song with a bridge. It could serve that purpose.
Yeah.
It's sort of a presupposing of what ordinarily wouldn't be there. It might be a little unusual to have bridge right off the top.
Yeah.
But there's really there's plenty of I mean, there's music that's hardly changes at all, too.
Yeah.
It can be pretty strong, good stuff. It's all over the place. And popularly, it is very typical to have what I now call a verse, although it's not quite the traditional old verse of 80 years ago. But so typically there's maybe some kind of intro that maybe it sounds kind of like the verse. And now I'm just rattling off details about that. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I mean it is. I mean because
okay.
I mean, in music it's kind of fairly clear, right? When the music starts, you tend to hear that yeah, they started playing, right? The musicians, I mean, normally. Yeah, and when they stop, you tend to sort of notice that, oh, that was that song. Okay, so can you play my favorite now? And then they play the favorite, and you're happy, right? So kind of they take care of things. So, but what happens in the middle is, and I mean sometimes people go on improvisation, right? And there's no secret that I sometimes do that as well. And in the middle of the story, I can sort of, oh, a squirrel, and then I sort of go on and sort of talk about the squirrel for a while, and it has nothing to do with the story I started with. It just happened along, right? So
it's a bit like your bunny story, Zara.
Yeah.
You don't know where it's going.
So sometimes you have kind of enormous creative latitude, and sometimes you have also, with my kids when they were little, they wanted to hear the same story again and again, and there was hell to pay if I didn't tell it exactly the same time, the same way over and over and over and over. Because as me, I got lazy sometimes. I wanted to shorten it, right, so I could sort of myself go to sleep, and they would have none of that, right? So Dad just skipped the part, right, and they would really have look kind of. They wanted the full thing, right? So, so there's some kind of a deeper structure in terms of how the story then gets constellated in the audience's mind as well. So there's obviously us sharing and telling a story, or playing a song, or and that's equally important how it is listened to, embraced, read, internalized, right? There's lots and lots of ways of sort of dealing with the story. The story comes your way, part of your hero's quest, or part of a song you're playing on the radio and listening in the car. And what I'm after here is kind of that sort of magical thing, right? What's happened sort of in between. There's the person sharing it, or the musician playing it, or the dead author having put stuff in the book, and suddenly the dead author sort of by magic comes alive when you read his or her book. So there's something happening in between that is so. I mean, it's a bit weird that no one really has a name for it. I mean, we could call it magic, but
Yeah, sometimes they do.
no, I mean, I have read books. Like, I think I'm fairly certain that Patanjali is an old Indian guy, right? He wrote Patanjali Yoga Sutras, which is kind of a book. If you don't create a leeway, right? It's kind of Yoga Sutras, right? And I think, to my best knowledge, that he's really, really dead, thoroughly dead, since a long time, right? If he ever existed, or if he's just a mythical figure. But when I go through those sutras, he's as alive as anyone. And some other books, kind of slightly more recently dead authors, they can feel much more stuffy. Like they're formally dead, and they're also story-wise dead, because that story is beginning to smell a bit funky, right? And you probably shouldn't read that book because it's just approaching Balvlitten territory, right?
I have, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I have an antithesis toward, there's some American writers who tell stories, but it's the same thing I don't like in marketing. They are showing how clever they are. And so I find those stories boring, and they're very famous and honored and win prizes and etc. And I read and I'm like, what? You know? This is like somebody in a coffee shop going on and on and on about how wonderful they are. That's the feeling I get. And it's like, if you're going to tell me a story, tell me a story. And it's the same thing with movies that have some message. I don't like those either. No, I just want a story. When it's time for story, I want a story. I don't want to be beaten over the head with a message. And I don't want to be dazzled, as it were, by your brilliance, because I'm not dazzled by your brilliance, because you're obscuring the story.
Yeah. I mean, I had a similar reaction when it was it the number now again? Star Wars 7, I think, or well, the latest one, right?
Okay.
And the special effects were beyond the charts amazing, right? And still, I was kind of disappointed because all the 6 previous ones, well, the ones from the 70s were obviously brilliant, because that's subjective from my point of view, because it was the 70s, and when I watched them I was, whoa, right, Star Wars, right? And then the new ones came, the numbers 4, 5, and 6, or actually they were called 1, 2, and 3. This is very confusing because George Lucas sort of didn't mean some strange order, right? But now the 7th is actually the 7th. Now the 7th blows all those other 6 movies away in terms of sort of the bedazzlement, right? But in terms of story, it was like the writers got sort of an assignment to kind of, put something together, will you? So we have some stuff we can throw lots of special effects in. I don't go with that. I mean, if someone is going to put $100 million into this kind of a movie, spend a couple of percent of that on the more script writers, right? So they can actually
preference, but I agree, and I know, for and screenwriters, casual talking and have a term, exploding helicopters. You just put them in for, the big boom effect, but it isn't really integral to the story.
Yeah. I mean, the same thing with one of the last Hobbit movie, number 3, which is also kind of one of those sacrilegious things to do, because the Hobbit is just one book, right? So you shouldn't done 3 movies, and I can understand that you make lots of more money, but The three movies were okay, except for one thing, right? Right at the end, right before the big battle, right? Where orcs battle dwarves and battle elves and battle humans and battle whatnot, right? Enters bloody sandworms, right? Funneling their way through the mountain. Now, sandworms are perfect in Dune, written by Frank Herbert.
Right.
But in Middle-earth, there are no sandworms.
Exactement.
So they shouldn't be anywhere near that movie. So someone had a bit of a meltdown. And, well, the kids love special effects, so let's put bloody sandworms in, right? So, and they could have just sort of, I would have been more happy if they would have just gone by helicopter and airdropped lots of orcs in, right? So,
well, I think the brilliance of Tolkien was taking the all this oral tradition of folklore, as it were, and combining it into a really delightful story
yeah.
with a charming narrator. You know, The Hobbit.
Yeah. I mean,
and The Hobbit is us, of course.
yeah. I mean, ordinary people, right?
Ordinary people, right?
Yeah. Now, I mean, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, obviously, right? And I mean, sometimes we forget that with this whole digital thing, it's kind of a virtual real realm, right? Where suddenly we can sort of explore and sort of transcend all normal space-time boundaries, and we can sit, the three of us, having a cup of coffee as if we sit around just this one coffee table and share a couple of stories, right? And having a chat. If I understand this correctly, you are now in something called America, right? Which is kind of, could as well be Middle Earth from my point of view, right? You're sitting in some fable land where you elect presidents, and well, if you try to elect presidents, it doesn't. You are not doing a really bang-up job so far. So I mean, what do you do, right? Sometimes you get sandworms, right? And you're kind of ruining a perfect.
Sometimes you get sandworms, yeah.
And sometimes you get spray tan and orange hair, right? What should you do about it? Not much, right? You just have to suffer through that really bad part of the script, right? But then the beauty is that we can have these technologies, if Hangouts are to be seen as a technology, which kind of is embedded in another technology called Google Plus, which is embedded in yet another technology called the web, which is embedded in yet another technology called the internet, I think. So lots of technologies sort of got nested and embedded into each other, right? And here we are sitting and sort of making some good use of these technologies, as we should. So it's these technologies suddenly, when used, can be used for us to enact a different space, not a different space-time. So the space in itself could then be seen as virtually real, because I feel a distinct sense of being real right now, even though I'm sort of imagining that I'm talking with other people, and I'm actually just looking into my webcam, right? Which is kind of me imagining things. And I hope that you feel somewhat real over at your end, whatever that end is, place is. So in between us, that was kind of my point, right? That stories help us sort of weave between the teller of the story and the listener of the story. So the story is what keeps that renders that realm, right? And the magic's in the middle. The virtual real realm would not be all that much fancy to sort of to be bothered with if there wouldn't be stories in it somehow. And there's lots of stories, right? I mean, the technologies all by themselves are also social artifacts and ergo anchored in stories, right? Someone had a brilliant story. Hey, let's build a thingy, right? And let's call it a technology,
Yes.
and let's call it web or internet or, I mean, that guy, I forgot his name now, guy who basically invented the internet and just then promptly gave it away, right?
Tim Berners-Lee.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, that's a great story, right? Also, kind of an uncommon story to used to give things away like that, right? Like some other kind of pinko comic, right? And you need to deal with those, right? But so there's stories in so many different dimensions and rendered in so many different ways. But is it actually possible to sort of, or do we ruin the magic by sort of trying to name it, right? Can we actually sort of, is there a virtual real language, right? Or is it, we can only approach it indirectly by stories? I mean, we know that it's something, right? There's a conversation in between the three of us, so that creates a space already.
I don't have that answer right this second.
I
Seems
don't
like it's
either.
really hard to nail it down, and I'm really deep into everything you're talking about, as you probably know, John.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
And I don't have an immediate answer that comes to mind. What it makes me think of is that the feeling I get when I read fiction is I don't want that to just have to be when I'm reading a story that an author prepared for me. I want to have that feeling all the time or a lot of the time.
yeah.
So I feel that when I try to allow that to happen right now in our conversation and in the online conversations, the stream you were talking about. And the thing that makes it work for me is that it's not just the story is not just a running account. It's, to me, it has to have a fictional part, supposedly fictional.
Yeah.
But it turns out that the fictional part is just part of the psyche, and it's a real thing that has real effect. And to leave it out, it's just no fun.
Yeah. I mean, it's like me when I go to, when I actually, it feels to me like when I read Lord of the Rings or Hobbit, right? Tolkien books, right?
Yep.
Silmarillion. I almost can't stop myself from going on a short visit to the related maps as well, right? I go there.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that my normal, usual kind of down-to-earth self knows that John Ronald Reuel and his son Christopher just made those maps up, right?
Yes.
You would be really hard pressed to find that you can go there, right? You can actually go to sort of the movies kind of Hobbit place because I think they kept it now from the last movie, right? So you can actually go there with the round door and thing, right?
Yes.
It's a bit of a blurring thing in between the two realms, right? But typically in fiction, you just have to imagine it, and for me, that's always been with me, right? That doesn't make it any less real. I mean, similar in Harry Potter, when Harry dies and he goes to meet Dumbledore, right? Who died in the movie before, I think. So they meet there, and they're both dead, and they're both talking, and that doesn't strike anyone as sort of strange, right? Because that's what you do, right? You die and you go to meet and have a chat with other people who just recently died before you, and then you have a jolly good conversation, right? And the thing that struck me that I remember, and Harry says to Dumbledore right in the middle of King's Cross Station, because when you die you go to King's Cross Station, that's kind of obvious, right? That's what you do. Is this real? He asks Dumbledore. Or is this just in my imagination? And then Dumbledore says, well, if it's just in your imagination, why would it be any less real? and I was just sort of transfixed when I saw that segment of the movie, right? Because it just felt true, right?
I think you posted that scene, or somebody did, because I remember that.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of other things, right? Because he needs to die because he had kind of a Horcrux, and there lies a kind of a poor little sad excuse of a part of Voldemort, right, at King's Cross as well, right? And then he goes back, so now he's freed from that little thing. But
why would it be any less real? That's the key.
I mean, why would the story be any less really just because someone just made it up on the spot, right? So we're probably approaching that sort of magical liminal realm, right, where
yes,
we are at least, if someone else has more imagination than we, then just makes up, first you die and then you go to King's Cross, and we were just, okay, that's how it works then. And another fun thing was that Harry notes that it's King's Cross, but it's much cleaner, right? So I just laughed out loud when I saw that part, because that might also be true, right? We get to imagine pretty much the story we would like the story to be, right? Because that's how you sometimes tell apart stories from reality. Reality has a bit more of a sort of dog poo involved, right? You don't get much, at least not in my dreams, right? In my imagination. I don't sort of just go around imagining dog poo constantly, right? But in reality, that's sort of part of the deal when I go outside without little mutt here in the park, right? But there's no... I mean, the unfolding storyline. The magic would then be of two kinds, right? One, the portal kind, where we could go whiz back and forth. At the drop of a hat, Sarah can sort of tell her grandkids any which kind of story about anything, right? She's kind of a wise and accomplished portal traveler, right? But there's also this kind of magic in terms of just going on, right? We don't have any trouble with sequels, right? Maybe we should in terms of Hollywood and they sort of bombarding us with sequels, but we're okay with sequels, right? I mean, I hope so. Kind of, if there's any listener, viewer, reader of this particular send, there might be in the near future kind of an episode 3 of the unfolding storylines, kind of, and so let's brace ourselves. Episode 3 is coming. And I mean, this was question. The last one was, previous one was questions. This one is stories, questions and stories, and then. I mean, we could just say, episode 3 is the brilliant finale, right?
Beginning, middle, end. There you go.
But then we would sort of be in trouble if we would want to do an episode 4, right? Or would that be kind of
another series?
That would be that would be the start of the sequel, right? Content marketing strikes back, right?
Oh, that's great. Well, I think in fictional stories, there's there's always the element of the suspension of disbelief, so that if you die, you go to King's Cross. Within the framework of the story, that works, and whether that's true in real life or not, we don't know. But it's the same thing in Wim Wenders. What's it called? Wings of Desire is the English translation.
Yeah.
And the angels hang out in the library. Okay, so now every time I go to a library, I don't care where it is. It doesn't have to be in Berlin. I'm like, are the angels here? That is like with me forever. The angels in the library watching over people and listening to all their different stories, and then also the angels communicating with each other. It's a beautiful film. Oh, it's just so beautiful.
Yeah.
Um,
It's
but
with
the
you.
but the we and that whole story is a suspension of disbelief because it's about an angel who comes to Earth and sheds his angelic qualities to become a human being.
It's with
Um,
you. It's with you forever, you said, and that speaks to your earlier point about memory and uh,
Yeah.
and fictional memories are real memories, and it's with
yes,
you
they
forever
are
now.
real
It's
memory.
part of your reality.
Yeah. I mean, we had this Swedish author who was tasked writing the foreword to Rilke's Duino Elegies, right? An
Uh,
impossible task, right? But he found a way to solve writing the foreword. Uh, and he said, and I can't remember the full thing, right? But he said something along that Rilke is not after sort of outlining angels and sort of in the, sort of the biblical capacity. He's after having us hear and notice angels as if they would be better versions of ourselves, which means that
Mhm.
they might be alive and well in fiction, in memory, in collective intelligence, in culture, in civilization, in evolution, in lots of all these things that are sort of seemingly sort of separate by these clever use of lots and lots of different words, right? Civilization
And
goes
in the
here,
developing
memory
tech.
goes over there. This bookshelf only deals with culture.
Mhm.
This shelf is just old CD records about someone who we don't even remember to listen to anymore, and so on and so forth. But the angels could be that capacity in us that is all sort of connected, right? So I don't give him I can't sort of make him justice, kind of, because he wrote really beautifully. So once you read that forward, you could actually understand much better the actual elegies, because the elegies are a bit of a mouthful, right? Because they start with "Who if I cried out," and then you sort of just beware if you sort of call an angel, because if you respond, you will be reduced to a puddle on the floor, right? Which is
yeah,
yeah,
but I
yeah,
think with Rilke, because his poetry is not story, it's poetry, but Rilke is like, what is the seed within ourselves?
yeah,
I mean, that is the overriding sense you have when you're reading Rilke.
yeah,
And there's the beauty of the words and all of that, but I think the thing that touches us and stays with us with Rilke is that what is that
yeah.
beauty within us?
I mean, my pet theory is that Rilke sort of managed to sort of somehow scramble his head, or he had some kind of a very really benevolent nervous breakdown. So was out in the castle, the Duino castle, right? I mean, I think that's the name of the castle because the elegies are called Duino, right? Uh, and somehow that poetry is kind of the access codes, the portal codes in between realms, right? So poetry for me serves an essential function in, at least that works for me, whenever I'm too little caffeinated or just drab or boring or typically Swedish or having had too much to do or just plain out of imagination. It is unfailingly so. I just need to read a couple of sentences in that forward to the Duino elegies, and I just need to sort of open at random any one of those 10 Duino elegies, right? I mean, one thing, if I'm really bogged down, so my mind just works almost not at all, I can go to the end of the 10th Duino elegy, where the passage is kind of when something happily falls. And like that, yeah, okay, got it, I'm hooked up again, right? So now there's stories galore in my mind, right? And I mean, you could obviously do hard drugs to that effect, right? It's just that comes with some really definite side effects, so I tend to not do that, right? Except coffee, of course, right? Because that's sort of socially accepted. But poetry works like a charm every time, right? And the only known side effect I have is when you read too much poetry, as I might have done now and then, you tend to get a bit weird, right? And you sometimes need to restrain yourself. You don't want to break out in poetry right in the middle of the dinner conversation, right? If it's not just a very kind of pithy and poetic kind of dinner conversation, when it might sort of be just a ticket.
That's the way it is with a lot of good stuff. You can't, if you start, you can't let too much of it out, or it gets watered down.
Yeah.
So if you're too poetic, I'd be fine with it, but
I mean,
it doesn't usually work out.
It's like music, right? You can't.
Yep.
You can't recite the technical details of the score at the same time as you're singing it or playing it, right? It just ruins the whole thing, right? So.
Well, I was thinking more in terms of you can't break into song like right now, or like I would not do. And
I don't know. Ron, I'm infamous for that.
well, then, it depends on the situation and the culture and everything. Actually, there are times when you can do that.
Yeah.
So I was following your point, though, John, about being too much of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's.
Accepted.
I mean, that gives me an idea for kind of a coming sequel, right? When we do Conversations Down the Falling Star Lines, and then episode 7, Bollywood, right? Because if you do that frame, it's perfectly sensible that we just sort of break out in song for no apparent reason whatsoever, right? And then we just resume the conversation right after the song. So it's kind of, and it's, but I mean, honestly, these are things that we're going to be increasingly common when further down Falling Star, and as I see it, as we go into we're 7 billion human beings, heading towards 9 billion, if Hans Rosling is correct. And all these 9 billion people are going to be increasingly connected. Chances are, 50 years from now, 3 people like us will do this, but maybe not in English, right? And they will do it and not think twice about it, because it would just be a normal thing.
Yep.
So you talk with someone that happens to be somewhere else completely, and it for me, this is kind of still kind of a big thing, right? I mean, I mean, talking with you, and that's just wonderful that I met you, although we should never actually physically met, but this, I think, counts in a way. Because when I grew up, you didn't do that. You didn't talk with strangers, right? I mean, Mum told you, no, you shouldn't, right? And here we are talking with strangers. So it's, the story has some kind of a transformative character as well, right? When you have shared lots and lots of stories and listened to possibly even more, chances are that something has happened, right? Possibly not that you die and go to King's Cross and come back, because that's kind of stuff of dreams, possibly, right? But there's some kind of an everyday magic in. I think you said something of that, right? Where you said about some of the books being your friends, Sarah.
Yes.
That ties into that.
Quote from a friend of mine. It's not my quote, but yeah, but that sense of it. I mean, he said that just must be 20 years ago, and every time I look at my bookshelves, I think it. It stays with me. But I was also thinking that there's this storiness of real life. I don't know how to say this, but so I'll just tell a story. So 20 years ago, it's over 20 years ago now, my daughter and her best friend and I were living in a house together. My daughter had a serious illness, so we sort of reconnected. And then my daughter launched herself into, her own world, moved out, and her friend and I became roommates. So we had, over 20 years difference in age. And my friends would say, "You live with a 19-year-old?" And her friends would say, "You live with Katama's mom?" And we both said yes, because it worked as two human beings living together.
Yep.
And even now I say, Gabriella was my best roommate ever. And people are like, okay, and I say, how many roommates have you had that you come home from a day of work and you walk in the door and they do an interpretive dance? So there wasn't any hello or how are you or any of that stuff. It was just you're home, and it was expressed as a dance. And it's impossible to say that, because that was just the kind of person she was, expressing herself in dance. And that these are the connections that we make as human beings that aren't always in words, but they're filled with emotion. So that a story, whether it's a retelling of something that happened in real life or a fictional story, still take with us, give us that real experience, that emotional. What we remember in the stories is the emotional connection. So there's a way of connecting with human beings, and that's why we can read Rilke in translation, or anyone else in translation, and still, if the translation is good, the real emotional connection of what that is. And I just want to take one more example, and that is long ago when I was a poet in the schools and working with, young kids, 8, 9, 10, up to maybe early teens for the most part. And I was using Neruda as an example, and I kept reading these translations, and I was like, that is not what that poem says, because they were very scholarly translations, because Neruda's a Nobel Prize, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, that is not what he said. So I started translating Neruda because I wanted to get that, especially for kids, that emotional, the whoa, those mountains are so rough, and the blue smoke and all of these things that came in. It was like, let's not get intellectual about Neruda. Let's go to the emotional, the emotional core. And that is, I think, especially in translating poetry, what you're looking for is that emotional core. It doesn't have to be the words exact, especially when you're translating not only idiomatic phrases, but idiomatic phrases that are conceived by the poet. So, but the bottom line is, in any story, in another language or our language, that there is that emotional connection, and that's what we love about stories, and that's what makes us love to hear other people's stories, and why marketers keep saying, tell your story, which gets translated in action as some very boring, not very exciting, no emotional hit stuff. But when the story is told with that emotional connection, that's what makes it a story we remember and what we carry inside of ourselves, because we don't forget that story.
Yeah, I mean, I love every last nuance what you just shared, right? I mean, including your completely pulverizing those poor content marketers who are sort of doing disservice to stories. And you just did it by tone of voice. So I will sort of steal that tactic whenever I come across these miscreants, and I will change my tone of voice accordingly and see if they can get them to run away the other direction. So I think we're just fresh out of time, so we should
We
probably.
are, yes.
I mean, feel
I
free
love this
to.
conversation because we went so many different
Yeah, we did.
places in exploration.
So I mean, 1 minute, 2 hours each in closing, right? And Sarah, you, and then Ron, and then me, if that works for you. Um,
I would love feedback from people who see this about story and what story means to them. So please, whoever's watching, listening, whatever.
yeah, good. Ron?
I'm working on a story that's built from your post in the conversation community, John, and thread, and other links and threads that get connected with it to some extent. But I'm trying to restrict it, and we've done this sort of thing before, and it's part of what happens with me when I keep, as I said, I try to look at what's happening now as the story, and maybe it's a bit like what did you say, Zara? The storyness of life.
The story, yes.
Yeah.
And so in my case, it ends up the way I emphasize it, I guess, is that I do try to produce an artifact. I try to keep it alive, though, and that's what I'm working on now, John, and I'm working on it.
I'm really great to hear that.
And it's got to be, as I said, one more point is that for me to enjoy it, it has to be semi-fictional, even though otherwise it's just I'm writing the minutes of the meeting of the thread.
Right.
I was actually going to say something completely different, but my minutes I might sort of cram in and see if I can get away with, because riffing further on Sarah's brilliant thing, right? So the magic might actually be approached circumferentially, indirectly, by combining just on a whim, right? Maybe there's this thing called the storyness of life, but there could also be something kind of the lifiness of story. So that having that sort of portal by having those sort of two juxtapositions, right? And I not even sure if I know what that other thing even is. But
That's very promising to me.
That has never stopped me before, so I just blurted that out. Right? And I might have to think of John, oh God, did you actually say that? You don't even know yourself what it means, so how on earth could anyone else? But it's a story, right? I just created a portal, I think. So, and
Can I take a minute? Can I take a minute to elaborate on that, the lifiness of story? So I was with my writers group the other evening, and we were reading a chapter in the new story I'm writing, and in the story there's a farmer who has a farm dog, and the dog's name is Pup. And we're going along, and all of a sudden something happens, and Pup is chewing on a stick, and he gets very sick, and he passes out. And the people in my writers group are like, no, no. They're like, so one of them goes, save Pup, save Pup. And I'm like, no, that's not how the story goes. He dies. And they're like, no, you have to change the story. So it's like, and so now I'm working on how I can do that. But I think it illustrates how people get involved with a story on that totally emotional level. And it's a story. It's all made up. The characters are made up. everything is made up. And here are these, people who, talk about commas and semicolons and story structure and sequence and all that sort of thing. And yet when the story is there, they're like, no, we don't want this to happen in this story. That is the lifiness of story, is that there's such a powerful emotional connection that people respond.
Ah, so it actually did mean something. I'm really relieved to hear that. So today you've listened to, watched Sarah Altair, Ron Scroggin, and me, John Kellden. 1 week or 2 weeks from now, possibly a Thursday around the same time, there will be an episode 3, which I'm not 100% sure what it's going to be called, but the theme is going to remain conversations and unfolding storylines, which means that the third one is following on to episode 1, questions, and episode 2, this one, stories. Stories might lead to something. We don't know what that is, but we're going to explore that in our next send.
Unfolding.
Yeah. That's a possible great theme. So, but now we're kind of reaching the end to this one, which I'm kind of quite unceremoniously going to end, like pressing the little red button, which says stop sending, I think. So, cheerio, and until next time.
Ciao.